All right, everybody, we're going to move into the rest of our early Middle Ages talk and move into even the high Middle Ages a little bit, and then we'll cut it off and move into even more as we get into next week, like the Renaissance. Well, right here, we're going to look at some formative issues that bring us into the fun parts, I think, of the Middle Ages. As European rulers and the church together became more and more powerful, what's going to happen is there's going to be more and more interesting political and economic changes, powerful states that fight against each other. Most interestingly to me is, of course, you've got the Crusades, which are its own story. You've got conquest between kingdoms, but you also, if I get to it here, you've also got two major attempts of the Pope and the kings of various territories fighting each other over power within their own states. And we'll talk about the limiting of the power of a king by a king's own nobility, which is the first time this happens in European history. We'll take a look at that moment. And there we go. So let's just move into it. The first major topic, it has to do with the conquest of England by what is really a French king. Now, I got to be clear about this for those of you that actually follow this sort of thing. There is, when we get to 1066, which is the year that all this story happens, and 1066, there is an England that's mostly tribal Saxon people that live right here. Over here, you've got tribal Welsh people. Over here, you've got tribal Scottish people. Way over here, of course, you've got Ireland, but that's not part of the story. Then over here you've got the Kingdom of France, which is kind of it's a bunch of different Frankish nobles that are loosely ruled by a fairly weak king right here in Paris. And then over here it's interesting, you've got three different states that are basically part of France of the time of 1066, but they're powerful separate states. Like Normandy, for instance, was actually formed when a bunch of Vikings, Northmen they called them, came down from the north and invaded and took over this territory. Well, over time, those Vikings, which are going to be called the Normans now, are going to blend in with the local French, and you're going to have this kind of hybrid French, Norman or Norseman state. And it's so powerful. This interesting state right here is so powerful with its military and the whole bit that the French king never is able to really control it. And so what that means is that Normandy, although it's technically French, they're called a duchy, and the guy that rules it like a king is called a duke. And the reason why that guy is called a duke is because he's considered to be a very powerful noble of France. But France really doesn't give this guy any orders. The king of Normandy, or the Duke of Normandy, really just handles his own affairs, and the French king gets to say that he's in charge of these guys, but in reality, the French king is not in charge of anything really over there. So we have Duke William of Normandy, who wants to be one day the king of England too, and we'll talk about why. We've got this other character in this story called Harold II, who is going to be the hereditary legitimate king of England. And then we've got this Viking guy named Harold Hardrada that's going to be part of this story as well. So what happens here? I'm going to just go through this real quick, all right? It's really simple. I guess it's simple. I don't know if it really is. What happens is when Harold was a young prince of England, his dad was named Edward, and young Harold, a young prince, was sent from England, from London really, to go live in Normandy, which was a big trading partner of England. And in Normandy, you've got Duke William, the Duke slash King of the powerful state of Normandy. Duke William is going to raise Harold II for much of his life. Duke William teaches Harold about the military, about the Norman style of military. Normandy has a very interesting military. It's very modern for its period. It's got very well bred horses, and those horses are the underpinnings of which there is a very powerful cavalry of soldiers who all have a new type of armor called ringmail, and these soldiers are actually more like knights on horseback than anybody in Western Europe has ever really been. And so these are, I mean, if you think about medieval knights on horseback, the Normans are really the guys that are starting that trend for Western Europe. These medieval soldiers on horseback. Over here and in the rest of much of the Western world, if you went to war, you had troops that were all on shield walls on foot, unless you're Normans. And hence the Normans were a very modern military state for their time, which means that it was hard to beat them, which is why the French never tried. They're like the French Normans are just get to do their own thing. Well, the deal is that while young Harold was living with William of Normandy, there is the story that William tells us. And what William says is that young Harold one day said, I don't want to be the King of England when I grow up. I really don't. I don't like my dad that much. I don't like how he's a king. I don't want to be king. And I would really rather that one day somebody else could be king. I just wish that we had another prince or somebody who could become king instead of me. And William, again, he's the one saying this, right? He's the one telling us this. William says, well, Harold, I will be happy to take over the throne of England if you want me to. And Harold II says, yes, please. You're like an uncle to me. You're a much better ruler than I would be. You can be the king, and I will continue being the prince. And that was the deal, according to William. Now, Harold never says that this happened. He says that this didn't happen, in fact, once the accusation was made. Well, here's what happens. 1066 rolls around. Harold steps up to become the King of England. William of Normandy says, hey, yo, bud, you said I was going to be the king. And Harold says, nuh-uh. And so William of Normandy is going to declare war so that he could take over England. So what William of Normandy does is he calls up a friend of his, a distant family member called Harold Hardrada, who is a Norse Viking, way up here in the Baltic. And he says, hey, Harold, I need you to make one of your raids this year, and I need you to come over here and attack the city of York. And while you're attacking York, Harold of England, I know these guys are both named Harold, just notice that they're different Harolds, right? Harold, the King of England, will take his English army of Saxons and come up here and defend York while I take a ship and a couple thousand troops and land here. No one will know that I'm coming because the entire army of England will be up here. So that's what the Duke of Normandy plans. And it works, guys. It totally works. Harold the Viking attacks York. Harold of England sends the English army, actually leads the English army up here to fight and beats back Harold the Viking. By the way, the goal here, Harold the Viking was promised land and money for his part of this. So that's why he does it. Okay, so Harold the Viking withdraws because he did his job, which was just to distract the English army. The English army then hears that William has landed dozens of ships and men, actually hundreds of ships, and thousands of men and all their horses and all their stuff have made a camp right here next to Hastings, this field called Hastings. And so Harold now has to take his entire army and march them 4 days straight south again to Hastings, where they're going to fight a battle. Now, Harold's men almost win the battle because they are a good, strong army of Saxons. And Normandy, these guys, they have all these troops that are across the channel. They're away from their supply base, and they're making this gamble. They're rolling the dice to try to defeat the English army. And it's horsemen. Get to this slide here. It's horsemen versus guys on foot. That's what's going on. But the thing is that the English Saxons actually did a great job fighting against guys on horses because they have their shield wall and their spears and their axes. I'm going to show you through YouTube. There's this animated video that shows us a massive propaganda work that William the Conqueror came up with when he wins the battle, guys. He wins the war. William the Conqueror becomes the new king of England within a couple months after landing his men. What happens, though, is that after this, William the Conqueror has to kind of convince everybody that he was right to do what he did, to actually attack a sovereign nation. And what William the Conqueror does, William of Normandy, he actually commissions the making of a giant woolen tapestry. This tapestry is over 200 feet long, and the tapestry has the entire story of Duke William getting mad and ordering his men to go and attack the English and how the English were finally defeated And what's really cool is that somebody took the entire 200-foot tapestry and turned it into an animated, cartoony style video that I'm going to show you. Okay, so hopefully that kind of helped a little bit. That was sort of fun to do. I love that thing. And basically, here's the timeline for you. Right, 1066. It's all the same year that the major things happen. Harold II is crowned king. 1066, the same year, William of Normandy kills Harold, and then this kind of French Norman king now becomes the king of England. For 200 years, folks, the kings of England were also Normans. if you wanted to be an aristocrat, you had to be somehow related to these Normans. There were still English tribal nobles. It's just that they didn't have much power now. So basically, if you lived here, if you lived in England and you were an original English Saxon, you were now the least powerful people, even if you were a lord, a noble, that is, before this whole thing happened in 1066, you were now a much less powerful person. And of course, the English Saxons are going to resent this for a long time. And there's kind of a culture class war that's going to happen for 200 years, where you've got the Norman French courts, the Norman French rulers of England versus the English Saxons of England. If you like those kinds of stories, I would recommend looking into like the movie slash video series. It's been redone a few times, or a book about Ivanhoe. It really gets into the class warfare between the Normans and the Saxons during this period. Um, the Robin Hood stories kind of hit this, but not much. But they're around the same time. Anyway, when this happens, then guys, here's Normandy and all the territory that Duke William controlled. And now he can include England into this. How does Duke William change England? He brings Norman culture to England. He organizes England under his own rule as a high king, and a whole new system of law and taxation, a very modern system compared to what England had already, is going to be put into place. And England is now set on the road to becoming a modern state. And really, we give William the Conqueror the credit for that because he was the one that took a bunch of separate, fierce, interfighting tribes and turned them into a kingdom for the first